Good evening, I'm Adrian Arsenault. Andrew is off. Tonight, a CBC News investigation into allegations of forced labor in factories that make personal protective equipment.
That the industry remains a hotbed of systemic forced labor and modern slavery.
CBC Marketplace reveals the human cost of the PPE that's keeping us safe.
What they are doing makes such a profound difference in my life and my ability to take care of people. Nobody's taking care of them.
As ICUs in Ontario and Quebec fill up with COVID-19 patients, the provinces prep doctors to make life and death decisions about who gets priority care.
I've never had to make decisions like this.
Also tonight, preparing the U.S. Capitol for an inauguration like no other.
It looks like a police state down here. We've never seen it like this.
And a bit of parental ingenuity.
Usually the joy in tobogganing is going down the hill, and now the joy in tobogganing is going up the hill.
A mom and dad enlist the help of horsepower to avoid the dreaded drag. This is The National. On the very front lines of this pandemic, personal protective equipment could be a lifesaver. Medical masks, shields, gowns, and gloves keep our doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers safe. But how safe are the people who make that PPE? Well, tonight, a CBC Marketplace investigation reveals allegations of forced labor and violence at disposable glove factories. This is happening overseas, but the gloves themselves could be ending up here in Canada. Marketplace spoke with dozens of workers in Malaysia. Now, we aren't getting any more specific than that or revealing their identities because they fear for their jobs or their lives. Asha Tomlinson with what those workers are telling us.
The PPE business is booming, but there's a dark side to glove manufacturing overseas. After speaking with nearly 24 migrant workers in Malaysia, we've learned of outrageous recruitment fees, excessive overtime, unsanitary dorms, even violence. This whistleblower worked at Top Glove, the world's biggest glove manufacturer. He says he tried to speak up about his heavy workload and hot conditions.
After I complained, he beat me a lot. He hit me with the helmet 2-3 times every day.
Another insider secretly records this video and says COVID protocols are not being enforced.
We are doing COVID tests because many people in the company are infected.
A massive outbreak halted some production late last year. Nearly 6,000 workers were infected. One worker died. Andy Hall is a labor activist.
The industry remains a hotbed of systemic forced labor and modern slavery.
We found products linked to Top Glove inside some Canadian hospitals and doctors' offices, including Dr. Nadia Alam's practice.
Oh my God. What they are doing makes such a profound difference, what they are doing makes such a profound difference in my life and my ability to take care of people. And it makes me mad that nobody's taking care of them.
The U.S. government recently banned some of these products, but Canada hasn't done much. We asked Minister of Procurement, Anita Anand, why the government isn't doing more.
We are working with our suppliers to investigate these allegations.
Top Glove tells us that they don't tolerate violence or harassment, and they have a hotline to report abuse with whistleblower protection. They also say they're improving their living and working conditions.
So, Asha, can you tell us more about how these workers end up in this kind of situation?
Well, many of them get stuck, Adrian, in debt bondage. So they have to pay these recruitment fees to third-party agents just to get the job. They already start their jobs deep in debt and owe massive loans to loan sharks. So they take home as little as $2 an hour, and you can imagine it takes months, sometimes years, for them to pay these fees off.
Okay, so in the name of preventing it, what are the options for a country like Canada?
The government does prohibit the imports of goods that are linked to forced labor. Our Border Services Agency tells us, though, that they haven't stopped any shipments because they say it takes significant research and analysis to flag these types of goods. Our experts say, though, that an outright ban isn't necessarily the answer. They say that it could make the situation worse. Workers could lose their jobs. We could see a decrease in overall supply. They point to a country such as France and says France has passed a law that demands transparency from these manufacturers. If they don't comply, they could face civil liability.
Okay, interesting. Asha Tomlinson, thank you.
Thank you.
And you can watch the full investigation on Marketplace tomorrow night, 8 p.m. on CBC television, 8:30 in Newfoundland and Labrador. So now let's turn to the COVID-19 situation here. Canada's two largest provinces still lead the way in new and severe cases. After a brief dip yesterday, Ontario is back above the 3,000 mark today with 3,326 new infections. 388 people are in intensive care. And Quebec's numbers also back up slightly today, posting 2,132 new infections, 230 people in ICU. Now, in both provinces, doctors are now preparing to have to make some incredibly tough decisions about who gets prioritized for care if the hospitals get overwhelmed. Alison Northcott with the concerns that's raising.
Officials in Quebec and Ontario have been warning hospitals are nearing a critical point.
Our healthcare system is at risk here.
Now they're preparing for the worst with tools ready to help medical staff make unthinkable decisions around who should get critical care if ICU capacity runs out.
Even reading the protocol turns my stomach. I mean, I understand it. It's based on saving the most number of people based on their overall likelihood of surviving. So the spirit of it is good, but I've never had to make decisions like this.
It hasn't come to that yet, but critical care staff in both provinces have been told to prepare.
It is contrary to everything that any physician, I imagine, has ever been taught.
The Quebec protocol involves a 3-person team in each hospital.
You get a score that reflects your chance of survival. And the ethical principle behind it is, of course, to maximize the benefits, to save the most lives. And so the patient with the best chance of survival will be prioritized.
But it all brings up so many ethical questions.
You can't decide who lives and dies by a memo from the government.
David Lepofsky is an advocate for people with disabilities. He spoke out against an earlier version in Ontario from the first wave that was later rescinded. He's still worried this kind of triage could lead to discrimination.
It's wrapped up in a bunch of medical language, but it still risks serious discrimination against some patients with disabilities.
Quebec changed its protocol after similar complaints. Ontario's says the approach aims to prevent bias, while doctors in both provinces say they hope the situation they're preparing for never happens. Alison Northcott, CBC News, Montreal.
Today was day one of Ontario's new province-wide stay-at-home order, an effort to bring down those case counts. But there remain many questions over what is and is not allowed, even from those expected to enforce the rules. Ellen Morrow on the danger that could cause.
A near-deserted Gardiner Expressway during the lockdown in March. Today, a rush-hour crawl on a stretch of the same road. It's no wonder, says this epidemiologist.
It feels like a stay-at-home suggestion. But when we talk about non-essential businesses being open for 11 hours a day and everyone's up to everyone to try and figure out what is essential for them, it leaves people pretty confused.
This was the alert sent to phones across Ontario. It is the law. Stay home, it says. But while the province's stay-at-home order lists more than 24 acceptable reasons to go out, it also gives residents room to interpret what's essential, and police have limited powers to enforce the order, unable to stop cars just to check if someone's complying. If someone is stopped, they're not required to explain why they're not at home.
I don't think you could ever come up with this is black, this is white, this is what you're allowed, and this is not what you're allowed. So it won't be much different from what our officers do on a daily basis.
Under Quebec's curfew, if someone is outside after 8 p.m., they can be stopped by police. In Manitoba, non-essential items were blocked off in big box stores. Not so in Ontario, though inspections at those stores are being stepped up.
It's like, what can we do, what we can't do? You know, like I've been confused since the beginning.
I am not confused. Essential means you have food, you have air to breathe, you have the drugs that you need.
It has many wondering what impact the order will actually have on Ontario's dire COVID case count. If none, the province could be just weeks away from full ICUs and a healthcare catastrophe. Ellen Morrow, CBC News, Toronto.
While much of Canada grapples with these crushing case numbers, there is some cautious optimism in British Columbia. Active cases in the province are down more than 50% from their peak a month ago. But health experts warn it wouldn't take that much to undo it all. Tanya Fletcher explains how.
Take a stroll through Vancouver and you'd hardly know this province is in the middle of a pandemic. Yes, people are wearing masks and most are standing 2 meters apart, but diners are in restaurants and shoppers are in stores.
We have seen a decline in cases here in BC over the past number of weeks, and I want to thank British Columbians.
Hospitalization rates here remain the lowest of the hardest hit provinces. Despite accelerating at a similar pace as the others in the fall, BC has plateaued. It's a relief following a surge in new cases late last year. There was a post-Christmas bump, but now the curve is trending downwards once again.
That's a fragile place to be, with any sort of new outbreaks can rapidly increase that once again.
This pandemic preparedness researcher cautions COVID complacency could send that curve right back up.
Being smug is something that we should definitely avoid. I'm seeing a narrative emerge that British Columbia is doing well, and look at Ontario and Quebec, they are struggling. That doesn't necessarily help with improving our own perspective.
Also a threat, the changing virus. In the news today about the new variants discovered in BC. Now 4 cases of the one first identified in the UK and 1 new case of the variant first discovered in South Africa.
This is a massive concern and definitely something to watch for.
Daniel Coombs has been helping the province with its modeling. He sees it as a race between the spread of the new variant and the mammoth task of vaccinating the masses.
Ultimately, we're going to lose, but we have a lot to gain if we can hold up the introduction and establishment of this strain, by 4 weeks or by 6 weeks or by a few months.
If we can buy enough time to hold off widespread transmission of the new variants, he believes the current restrictions in BC should be enough to hold that firewall if people continue to follow them. Tanya Fletcher, CBC News, Vancouver.
Phase 1 of the national immunization campaign has been criticized for being too slow. But today, the soldier in charge outlined the plan to ramp up deliveries and vaccinate members of the general population starting in the spring.
The quantity of doses arriving in Canada is anticipated to average more than 1 million doses a week for both currently approved vaccines, starting in April.
Fortin said detailed plans about Phase 2 will soon be shared with provinces and territories. Ottawa is confident it will meet its goal of distributing 1.3 million doses by the end of January. So far, some 420,000 shots have been administered. We have set up a vaccine tracker on our website so you can see the number of doses delivered to each province and how many have been administered to Canadians. That is at cbc.ca/vaccines. A top CBC Radio Canada executive is one of the latest public officials called out for traveling outside Canada against the advice of public health officials and political leaders. He is in charge of all French language services. Catherine Cullen with his story and how travel has become a sore spot for so many Canadians.
He may have gone to Miami in December to deal with his condo while working remotely, but Radio-Canada executive Michel Bissonnette stayed for 10 days of vacation too, quarantining, he says, when he got back. After the National Post reported on the trip, Bissonnette said in a statement, "I am sincerely sorry and I apologize to employees and citizens." Politicians and health officials have lost their jobs for vacationing in a pandemic. Bissonnette's job title may be different, but he acknowledged his trip has provoked a reaction.
It certainly feeds into a sense of entitlement or elitism.
7 out of 10 respondents in a recent poll said they've put off or canceled trips, and many want the government to clamp down.
The visceral reaction is, well, why do you get to do that when I'm trying to do the right thing?
CBC President Catherine Tate has also come under scrutiny, twice spending more than a month in New York City since the start of the pandemic. A CBC spokesperson said the travel was to care for her husband, who lives there and had undergone a medical procedure. The government has discouraged non-essential travel.
No one should be vacationing abroad right now.
But officials note the Constitution gives Canadians the right to leave and return.
If you look around the world at countries that have requirements for exit visas, I'm not sure we want to be on the list of those countries.
I'm gravely disappointed, alarmed, and almost growing panicky, to be honest.
Though travel accounts for a small fraction of known COVID cases in Canada, that's likely a failure to track cases properly, suggests this epidemiologist.
But when our healthcare system collapses and we have refrigerator trucks parked outside hospitals, the big question that we need to ask is, really, are vacations that important? Is travel that important?
Particularly with new variants of COVID circulating, he warns vacationers they're putting lives at risk. Catherine Cullen, CBC News, Ottawa.
The COVID situation in the United States remains dire. Multiple states are recording record high case numbers and hospitalizations. And a frightening forecast from the Centers for Disease Control. 92,000 Americans could die in just the next 3 weeks. Vaccinations are continuing to lag demand. 30 million doses have been distributed. Only 11 million people have received them. There is another big concern right now south of the border, the potential for violence around Joe Biden's inauguration after the attack on the U.S. Capitol. Katie Simpson takes us to D.C., where security is tight and worry is growing.
If the president needed a reminder that his term is nearly done, there's one right outside his door. Risers for Joe Biden's inauguration are being set up as thousands of National Guard troops fan out around the Capitol to try to prevent a repeat of last week's violence.
It looks like a police state down here. We've never seen it like this.
The perceived success of the Capitol attack may embolden domestic extremist groups, according to a new warning reportedly being shared among law enforcement agencies.
Our posture is aggressive.
At an inauguration security briefing, the FBI confirmed 100 arrests have been made so far, and they're monitoring several active threats ahead of next week's events.
We are seeing an extensive amount of concerning online chatter. We're concerned about the potential for violence at multiple protests and rallies.
Playing a vital role here.
After sitting in on that briefing, the vice president visited the frontline troops in what could be seen as an attempt to illustrate the Trump administration actually does support the upcoming transfer of power.
Thank you all for stepping forward to serve your country. Thank you for stepping forward to provide security.
As investigators start to get a better picture of exactly what happened last Wednesday, some lawmakers are demanding to know whether rioters scoped out the building in advance. This Democrat claims she saw Republicans giving tours of the grounds, even though visitors are banned because of COVID.
And we now know that those violent groups that attacked the Capitol complex had inside knowledge of the Capitol grounds.
There are also fresh fears of revenge attacks against members of Congress who voted to impeach the president. So much concern, some are taking security into their own hands.
Many of us are altering our routines, working to get body armor, which is a reimbursable purchase that we can make. It's sad that we have to get to that point, but our expectation is that someone may try to kill us.
So, Katie, I know you're as close as you can get to the U.S. Capitol tonight, and it's hard. What are you seeing?
Adrian, as you can imagine, right now the military presence is pretty intense. Let me show you. You can see members of the National Guard are holding a line here on the front lawn of the Capitol, which has become a sort of staging ground. You've got some military vehicles, you've got some buses, and we've actually seen members of the National Guard hopping in and out of those buses to try and keep warm. It's kind of chilly here in Washington tonight. Now, even though we have seen some startling images of the security measures that are in place right now, more images are coming as more troops are coming, more help is coming. By the time Inauguration Day gets here, some 20,000 members of the National Guard alone will be here to try and keep inauguration and the whole process safe. Adrian.
Extraordinary. Katie Simpson in Washington tonight. Thank you, Katie. Canada's top new military commander offered an apology today as he officially took leadership of the armed forces.
I apologize to you, my teammates,
our teammates who have experienced racism, discriminatory behavior, and/or hateful conduct.
Admiral Art McDonald becomes Canada's new Chief of Defence Staff in the midst of ongoing efforts to address sexual misconduct and harassment within the ranks. He is the first naval officer to hold the post in more than 2 decades. And Canada's highest court has refused a bid by the Roman Catholic Archdiocese in St. John's to appeal a ruling that found it liable for sexual abuse at the former Mount Cashel orphanage. The case involves multiple allegations of sexual abuse committed by priests at the institution dating back to the 1950s. The Archdiocese will now have to pay the 4 lead plaintiffs about $2 million. A high-level martial arts coach has been found guilty of sexually assaulting a young athlete. She was just a teen at the time with dreams of going all the way to the Olympics. Jamie Strachan has her story and why some say this fits a pattern of Canadian sport failing to protect young athletes.
I mean, it was a sense of relief, but my jaw dropped.
For the victim in this case, her identity protected by a publication ban, today's news was welcome, but the story isn't over.
And the post-traumatic stress disorder I deal with on a daily basis is not something that will go away now that we've gotten a guilty verdict.
As a teenager, she came to the Toronto studio of renowned Taekwondo coach Shinwook Lim, with aspirations of one day competing in the Olympics. Instead, the one-time national team coach asserted total control over her life, cutting her off from friends and family, sexually assaulting her multiple times, eventually raping her.
He would often describe his position of power as like if you as the athlete were a race car, he was the driver. So you and your parents were to hand over full control of your life.
It took years for her to realize what she had gone through, and she finally went to the police.
I would lay there in bed at night and think, this is something that I'm going to take this to my grave.
Lim is the latest high-profile Canadian coach to be accused or convicted of assaulting someone they were trusted to teach.
For a country that prides itself on, child protection and human rights, we're sure dropping the ball in sport.
University of Toronto's Gretchen Kerr says coaching remains virtually unregulated. Winning is paramount.
Their very existence depends on performance outcomes and the success of the athletes.
Nearly 2 years ago, a CBC News investigation revealed more than 200 cases of young athletes being abused over a 20-year period, mostly in amateur sport. It prompted many promises, and some changes were made.
I think there has been a huge gap between what we aspire to and what we have. We had policies over 20 years ago to deal with some of these things. The policies are not enforced.
Kerr says that until that happens, athletes remain vulnerable. Jamie Strachan, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, we are at the end of the warmest decade on record and getting a glimpse into the severe effects playing out in Canada's north.
The caribou is no longer going into the forest for shelter.
Up next, why hopes for a pandemic silver lining just didn't pan out.
I know that essential means different things to different people.
At Issue takes on the differing and sometimes confusing provincial approaches to managing the second wave. Moscow fast food with a controversial name.
I feel that it's like in Berlin, you will make Hitler Doner.
Chris Brown shows us why this attempted Russian rebrand goes deeper than Doner's. We are back in 2. Look at that. Some intense winter weather stopped southern Saskatchewan. Strong winds created some wild blizzard-like conditions. Several highways were forced to close. More than 100,000 homes lost power today. Obviously, a major cleanup was underway with some serious damage scattered across the whole region. Well, 2020 was a punishing year for our health, our economy, and it seems our planet. A pair of new climate reports reveals 2020 to be one of the warmest ever recorded. Tashana Reid looks at what that means, especially for Canada's north.
For Fred Sangris, warmer winters means navigating new risks every day.
There's dangers because of thin ice. It's not freezing like they used to. People are going through the ice as they traveled. and they, if they don't get injured, then they lose their life.
The impact of climate change can't be ignored in northern Canada. Ice roads over water are becoming less reliable. The migration of animals is changing too.
The caribou is no longer going into the forest for shelter and for food. They're so warm now that they're staying up in the open tundra.
Today, NASA and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration said the Earth was about 1 degree warmer than when record keeping began 141 years ago, contributing to unprecedented wildfires in Australia, California, even Siberia.
We're already seeing how some heat waves, for example, are already increasing in intensity, in frequency. Some areas across the globe will see more intense, more severe drought.
And the area warming the fastest is the Northern Hemisphere, in particular, the Arctic.
The more you lose snow, the more you lose sea ice, the warmer temperatures change, the warmer temperatures increase. That in turn melts more snow and ice.
And while global shutdowns during the pandemic reduced greenhouse gas emissions, in the end, it made little difference.
When you emit greenhouse gases, they do remain in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, in the case of carbon dioxide, for instance. So any short-term changes will not have any immediate impact on the climate system.
And modeling predicts the next decade will be even warmer if countries around the globe don't cut emissions faster. Tashana Reid, CBC News, Toronto.
Coming up, something a little bit different. Our Chris Brown checks out a Russian Doner shop named after a historical figure. The problem is that figure is Stalin, and some Muscovites are furious. But first, Rosie is here with that issue. Rosie?
Hey, Adrian, we're going to check in on the political messaging from premiers as the crisis worsens. From curfews to stay-at-home orders, what's working, what's not, plus cabinet shuffles and election speculation. Chantal, Andrew, and Althea will join all of us right after this. It has been a hard start to 2021. Cases of COVID-19 are high, ICUs are filling up, and the death toll is climbing. But the political response between provinces remains vastly different. From a curfew in Quebec to staying the course in Saskatchewan to Ontario's stay-at-home order.
You must, I'm going to repeat that, stay home. It's the law, and it will be enforced.
Political messaging that left many in that province confused.
I know that essential means different things to different people.
Different messaging that is hurting some premiers more than others. So for more on that, let's bring in at issue for our first panel of 2021, Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj. Good to see you all. Probably not too late to say Happy New Year, so I'll start with that. Obviously, everyone's hoping this year gets better, but certainly right now, that is not the case in vast parts of the country. Let's start in Ontario, where the stay-at-home order is now in effect, but there was a lot of criticism around the communication of it and the Premier's response to this second wave. I'll start with you on this one, Althea. What do you make of his messaging and the response to his decisions?
Well, I think it was confusing, and I think it's not just Premier Ford, but I think a lot of the premiers have really been more concerned about making decisions that were politically popular rather than probably taking the right public policy decisions. When you look at the numbers that we're currently facing, you have to wonder why there was not a stay-at-home order over Christmas, why people were not told that they should be staying home. And then, of course, when we have the additional measures that were announced this week, in Ontario, I think the messaging was unclear. I mean, we heard that from mayors across the province. It also, I think, just doesn't make a lot of sense to people. Like, the Premier is telling us to stay home. At the same time, he's allowing retail for non-essential businesses to stay open. Well, that means that those employees have to go to the office, even though they're not considered essential. And this also, I think, the sense now with Quebec's announcement this week that we're also being treated as some sort of guinea pigs.
Chantal, your take on Ontario, but weigh in on Quebec too, and this curfew that's been in place for a few days that also was, it seemed poorly communicated by the Premier, to say the least.
Maybe poorly communicated, but 70% support it. And as far as I can tell, living in a place that has the curfew, being observed rather religiously. I have to say that until Ontario came up with a stay-at-home order with 29 exemptions, as in you'd almost have to be stupid enough to say to the police, guys, I'm going to a party with all my friends from university. You could fit all those exemptions. You could see the merits of a curfew. It has at least the advantage of being clear. Now, all of that being said, I think we're in the, politically, we're in the finger-crossing period of the pandemic. So I think in Ontario, in Quebec, and Saskatchewan, the premiers are basically finger-crossing, hoping that this will level off and then start going down, and that any of the measures that they announce can do no harm.
It also strikes me, Andrew, that with things like curfew or stay-at-home order, that they might be trying to recreate that sense of urgency that we had the first time round, and that everyone is so tired with. And I wonder if that's sort of, as Chantal said, sort of their last hope, their last play.
Well, urgency and fatigue are not a good combination. People are less inclined 10 months into this to feel that sense of urgency. They're facing more resistance. I think there is the problem that you've got broad public support that you can see in some polls for tough measures, but narrow, vociferous groups who are very opposed to it, particularly in the business community. And I think politically, it's hard for politicians to face that down. I think they also make the mistake of considering this as being a conflict between the economy and health, when it's really more a conflict between short-term and long. That if you're not prepared to take the short-term hit in terms of the shutdown, you're going to pay a higher cost in the economy long-term than you would if you just bit the bullet and got it done.
Right. So are we at the point where there are political careers on the line here if they can't sort of get us through this next stage to vaccinations? Althea, you start.
I don't know. I think it's too early to say that. I think there are some people who might decide that after the pandemic is over, they don't want to reoffer to the citizenry, that they feel like they've done their time and had enough. I think what you're seeing is that people are having a hard time trusting the messaging. And after it's going to be 10 months, we're probably looking down to being in this COVID situation for more than a year. When the government doesn't appear to be transparent, that the government doesn't appear to be honest, the politicians need the public to believe them so that they can follow the guidance that they give them.
Chantal.
Two things. The premiers who resisted in the name of economics taking measures and are now facing rising cases, and I'm not just thinking of Jason Kenney, but a case in point, yes, are losing a lot of moral authority that will cost them down the line. But those are more possibly extreme cases. As for chipping away at credibility, I think one of the things that the public accepts in this crisis is that you can say effectively what Quebec said today, which will be questioned. But we have seen countless examples of premiers, and this premier in this province, changing his mind and changing tack in the face either of opposition or evidence to the contrary.
That's right.
So I'm not so sure that people are as quick to judgment overall when they still trust as you might believe when you read the newspaper or the social media the next day.
Andrew, last word to you.
You know, Quebec has, for example, objectively the worst record in this by far, the highest death rate, the highest infection rate, et cetera. And Legault is at, what, 75% in the polls, in the approval ratings. I'm not sure anybody's going to pay much of a price in the end for this, because we've set up a system that nobody can really be held to account. We've divided responsibility on this in such a way that nobody's really sure who's responsible for anything, and both levels of government therefore spend most of their time pointing fingers at the other.
Okay, thanks everybody. We're going to leave it there for just a moment, but we will be back with another round of At Issue to talk about, election speculation.
As I've been consistently saying, we don't want an election.
All right, so does this week's federal cabinet tell us anything about election timing? We'll talk about that right after this.
From the very beginning of any minority parliament, every political party understands that elections can happen. But as I've been consistently saying, we don't want an election. I made a promise standing here months and months ago that we would have Canadians' backs.
So, a federal cabinet shuffle fueling election speculation this week, mostly by journalists, I should admit. But does this signal anything about when Canadians could head to the polls? Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, Althea Raj, back for another quick round of At Issue. Chantal, you go first. What does that tell you, if anything, in spite of what the Prime Minister is saying around timing here?
I'm not sure that it says much of anything. It's a cabinet shuffle that allows the government to continue to govern for as long as it needs to, or puts it in a position where, for instance, it's got a better communicator that is freer to do so, François-Philippe Champagne in French in Quebec, if need be, and has freed up Mr. Baines, although he is going to be spending more time with his family, to strategize on an election campaign. So whatever way you want to look at it, I think it's the rule of minority governments that if you don't want war, you have to show that you're ready for it. And if you're the opposition parties and you don't want it, you also have to prepare for it. And well, that's basically where we are. I don't think we're going to be packing our bags to cover an election where we will need gloves and hats and scarves, not in the state of this second wave.
Yeah, what you said, two things there that I hadn't thought about, both about Champagne and former Minister Baines. Andrew, your thoughts on how this, well, I guess if it's not an election, how it positions the government, for one, to Chantal's point.
Well, it's always hard to take any cabinet shuffle terribly seriously in a government, and not just this government, but previous governments as well, that is so completely dominated from the center, from the PMO. This is a particularly non-noteworthy one. You had a not particularly distinguished industry minister decided he wanted to spend more time with his family. He's been replaced by a not particularly distinguished foreign affairs minister who will probably be a better fitted industry. He's viewed as being more business friendly than perhaps some other members of the cabinet are. I think it will suit him perhaps to try to, who has ambitions of higher office to come, to sort of round out his economic credentials this way. And Marc Garneau will go in at Foreign Affairs, and if anybody can tell me what Marc Garneau's achievements have been in cabinet, I'd be interested to know. So it's keeping things more or less in place.
You're getting no Christmas cards next year, I have to say, after that. I know you don't care, but I'm just saying. Okay, Althea, your thoughts on what it says.
Well, I agree. I don't think it says anything about election speculation. I think everything that we said before Christmas still applies. I think nothing prevents the Prime Minister from deciding that he has laid out a new economic plan and he wants Canadians to weigh in on it. Nothing this week suggests that he's more or less likely to do that. I think Mr. Baines, we have no reason to believe that he is leaving for anything other than the family reasons. Possibly he wants to make more money. And if it is a Scott Bryson-like situation, it is no doubt not surprising that the Prime Minister decided not to shuffle other members of his cabinet. Maybe he's learned from the Jody Wilson-Raybould issue, and instead he has promoted a loyal soldier, Omar Al-Gabra, to get a big promotion at Transport. I agree with everything Andrew said about François-Philippe Champagne. I think a lot of the things the government promised in 2019 have not been done that deal with the industry portfolio. Those clusters, cheaper cell phone bills, remember that? Broadband internet. And so François-Philippe Champagne has, like, in addition to the recovery, has a lot of stuff on his to-do list.
Okay, so I don't have very long, but Chantal, then would you say that there is no election until everyone is vaccinated, or is that still a possibility? No, you wouldn't say. Okay.
I wouldn't say that. I would say that there would be no election until the second wave is under control, flattened, a bit like the window for elections that we saw last summer, when New Brunswick and BC jumped in the right window and got the results that they hoped for by having elections.
Okay, Andrew and Althea, you have to answer that next week, so you can think of your answer before that.
It's okay, I agree with her.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, and good to see you again. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast, for extra content there, including the panel's take on this story this week.
What we witnessed was an assault on democracy by violent rioters, incited by the current president.
All right, well, you can find that on any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.
All right, thank you, Rosie. So what can you tell us about what you have planned? Because I know you've got something cooked up for Rosemary Barton Live this Sunday.
Yeah, you know me, Adrienne. Obviously, we'll just be a few days out from the inauguration in Washington, and you and I will talk about that more on Wednesday, of course. But we want to talk about sort of what Canada is doing in preparation for a new administration. So we will speak to Canada's ambassador to the U.S., Kirsten Hillman, and a few other surprise guests as we look at how things are unfolding down there.
Now you're talking. All right. Thanks, Rosie.
Okay.
Coming up, making the most of your own backyard in Calgary.
Usually the joy in tobogganing is going down the hill, and now the joy in tobogganing is going up the hill.
We'll show you a homemade winter wonderland.
I'm Jamie Poisson, and tomorrow on CBC's daily news podcast Front Burner, members of the Proud Boys have been linked to the Capitol attack, and Canada may designate the group as terrorists. Who they are and how they got here. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. Now, Joseph Stalin was, of course, the Soviet dictator blamed for the death of millions. He is also, oddly, the namesake of a new Doner shop in Moscow. Chris Brown shows us the provocative branding and how it reflects Russia's ambiguous view of a dictator.
How about takeout served in the image of one of the most heinous tyrants of the 20th century? Figures like Stalin are ambiguous, insists shop owner Stanislav Voltman, who says he has a historical fascination about the former Soviet dictator. He thought dressing up in a Soviet-era secret police uniform and serving food peppered with references to Stalin and his murderous henchman Lavrentiy Beria might make a cool business. Russian TV was there on opening day when Voltman fed hundreds of curious customers and then got a visit from local police who tried to shut him down. Later, someone spit on his window, and this man left a bloodied handprint and a sign saying Stalin and Beria are executioners. I'd have moral hesitation if I'd put up slogans in the deaths of people, but I'm not hurting anyone. On the one hand, the Kremlin has commissioned solemn memorials to commemorate Stalin's oppression and remember his millions of victims. But on the other, it's also been trying to rewrite history, to portray Stalin as a victim not just of the Nazis, but also of Western nations. After the Soviet Union broke up, Stalin's statues were either dismantled or relegated to this Moscow park. But of late, the Kremlin's been claiming that the Western allies betrayed Stalin, and opinion polls suggest a growing number of Russians see him more as a hero who defeated the Nazis. But as we filmed, many horrified passers-by beg to disagree.
I feel that it's like in Berlin, you will make Hitler Doner.
My grandfather was executed by Stalin. I would have closed this a long time ago. Voltman's staff quit over all the negative attention, though he's confident he'll soon find new workers to wear those KGB uniforms. Chris Brown, CBC News, Moscow.
Wow. So if your local ski hill is closed, well, how about building your own? With the slope and some mechanical know-how, we'll show you how it's done next. Well, the pandemic cannot stop this Calgary family from having some fun this winter. All they needed was their own backyard, a little snow, and some horsepower. So they found a way to turn their yard, their amazing yard, into their own ski resort. Tonight, their ingenuity is our moment.
My husband and I were getting worried that it would be a difficult winter with potentially a lot of shutdowns and lockdowns. I did some thinking and I thought, well, we have a wonderful little slope in our backyard. So in the end, I came up with the idea of turning it into a ski hill and having a bit of a tow rope. All the hard work to my husband, who's a mechanical engineer.
Just went back to some of the old things that I learned in the school and definitely took longer than I thought. Used a little bit of ingenuity, a lot of YouTube as well. When I first plugged it in, it was going way too fast. So I had to create this little pulley mechanism here and belt drive to be able to slow it down enough so that the kids could grab a hold of it.
I actually put it in mostly for me because I'm usually out with my 3 children who are, 6, 4, and 1, and I have been exhausted pulling the kids up the hills. It's become funny because usually the joy in tobogganing is going down the hill, and now the joy in tobogganing is going up the hill. So, we've changed the sport a little bit, but everybody's having a great time.
I totally want to do that. Okay, these are very lucky kids. That is a fantastic backyard, very handy to have a mechanical engineer around. Their next project, apparently, finding or making a grooming machine and making it ski slope worthy. That is a national for January the 14th.